We're just about there. We're almost into July, which means a couple of things. One is that news is only going to be about criminal related things or discontented players. So we've got Terry and Arnold, we've got Brandon Ayuk, but then also quarterback restructures and extensions, et cetera, because there's nothing else to talk about. And people tend to latch onto stuff because you get into debates about just how much is CJ Stroud worth, why nobody's even talking about Bryce Young. But a lot of smart people start weighing in on it. Some of the film watchers go back and watch more film and try to put things in perspective. So I've actually enjoyed this last week or so because as the news from OTAs and mini camps and everything died down, I've seen a lot of the people that watch a lot of film and watch the entire league at large kind of revisit the CJ Stroud situation and put things in perspective in a lot of ways. And I think there's two things. There's CJ Stroud, the football player, and then there's the quarterback contract environment and whether it might be poised to explode next year as multiple young quarterbacks, including Drake May, CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, multiple 6 or more quarterbacks, and I'm probably forgetting somebody there off the top of my head, that might be in line for extensions next year. So the figure for quarterbacks largely has hovered around $55 million per year. Over the last 3 years, it's been freakishly stagnant, other than Dak Prescott and Pat Mahomes, who are kind of one-off situations. Couple of unique things about both of those contracts. One, obviously, because just Pat Mahomes is Pat Mahomes, and he was playing at a discount over these last few years on a 10-year contract. That contract in that situation is just almost not applicable to any of these young guys. And then with Dak Prescott, Dak had pushed it to his franchise tag year, so just had more leverage in the situation when he negotiated his deals. He's around $60 million. But our own Bucky Brooks from the Bucky Brooks show on the Believe Network, he weighed in on it earlier this week. And he just flat out said that he thinks the Texans should just pony up the dough and pay CJ Stroud.
You have seen these quarterback deals. They only go up. They never go down. But more importantly, when you're CJ Stroud, there's no reason for you to take a below market deal. When you look to your division rival, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and you look at Trevor Lawrence, and Trevor Lawrence has a 5-year, $275 million contract, and you could argue that you're a more accomplished player than he has been. You also can look at Brock Purdy, you can look at Jordan Love, and you have reasonable arguments that your pay should exceed what they make or should at least be in range with what those guys make.
Okay, I agree with a lot of that. And now, we could argue about whether he has an argument that he should exceed those contracts, that he should make more than those. There are a couple things. One is, should he at least get Trevor Lawrence's deal or more than Trevor Lawrence based on what he's done? And to do that, you got to try to ignore the playoff performance. I know we can't ignore the playoff performance. I think that, yes, you can make an argument for that, but the Texans can also make the argument that, hey, we don't have to pay you. Personally, I have not been a fan of so many quarterbacks getting extended after their third year before they've really genuinely proven themselves to their team. We go, whether it's Trevor Lawrence, Tua Tagovailoa. Well, Tua Tagovailoa was in his fourth year and he got an extension. And Kyler Murray, Daniel Jones, when he got his extension, those are largely ones that didn't work out, except for Trevor Lawrence. We're still waiting to see whether it turns out, whether that works out. The difference, and this is again where it's interesting with a quarterback contract situation, is it's been hovering around $55 million per year. Trevor Lawrence got that deal in 2024, and the cap has gone up 18% since then. So even if you account for cap inflation, then if you get the same deal as Trevor Lawrence, that actually should be $64 million or so. I think that the one thing about that market was I think the quarterback market almost became a little insane for a moment, where teams were so convinced that quarterback salaries were just going to continue to rise so high that they just had to get ahead of the curve, because otherwise they're just going to get screwed if they don't extend these young guys now. What happened is it just kind of stabilized, and I think there was a bit of a correction. Receivers started getting paid more. Defensive ends started getting paid more. Rosters got a bit more balanced in terms of okay, where do we really need to spend? Who's really worth this or that? You know, along the way, you've had various quarterbacks, various teams win Super Bowls with guys that they either weren't paying a premium like Tom Brady, or that you got off the trash heap like Sam Darnold. You know, I know Brady's Super Bowl was well before 2023 and 24. But I think with the number of quarterbacks that are going to hit the market next year, that's where it does get interesting for the Texans. And I'm a fan of waiting to pay CJ Stroud. I think, for one, just having that carrot on a stick is a good thing. Two, I have some lingering concerns about the concussion, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But there's with 6 or more guys potentially getting extensions next year, I think they probably are going to push that $65 million mark. Now, if CJ Stroud has an awesome year and everything they've done on the offense to improve his play puts him into that top 7, top 8 category, and the Texans make more of a playoff push than they've ever made before, I'll happily say, looks like you should have gone back and paid him. But you know what? $10 million or more a year extra just to be sure of things isn't a huge price to pay if that's indeed what ends up working out. And that meanwhile, CJ's had this carrot on the stick. He plays for an organization that he knows will reward you if you perform and show it on the field. And we'll get into some of the either excuses for him or explanations for why CJ Stroud hasn't worked out. But I mean, one big one, obviously, is that he's just never had a good rushing attack around him. Here's Ben Solak, who's on Garrett Williams' YouTube channel, talking about just that, how pathetic the Texans' rushing attack has been all 3 years that CJ has been with the Texans.
My favorite Stroud-related stat is since he entered the league, Texans are 31st in EPA per rush, 31st in rushing success rate, which again is just how are you creating positive plays? The only team worse is the Raiders. They've had the Raiders running game his entire career, and defenses know this. Where's Stroud going to rank on the NFL top 100? I have no idea. But if you watch opposing defensive coordinators, how they play the Texans, they very clearly believe, okay, let's make the quarterback beat us because the running game isn't scary enough. It's not to say they rank Stroud like Patrick Mahomes, like, oh, please hand the ball off. But it's to say that like they for years now have been very comfortable playing with light boxes, playing with nickel personnel. They don't need to put base on the field. They don't need to run blitz because they just know they're never going to be able to just 5-yard grind us, 5 yards in a cloud of dust down the field. They don't have it in them.
Yeah, and look, it's really hard to operate in the NFL, including like in the modern NFL and the prehistoric NFL. 10 years ago, when people thought that the run game doesn't matter at all, you still have to be able to run the ball somewhat. And I think where it extends even further is I've told you guys before, look, the Texans' offense was better than people expect. Like when they look at the rankings, they're usually surprised that they see the Texans were the 13th scoring offense. And the problem was that they were pretty good at moving the ball between the 20s. When they got down into the red zone, they were one of the worst red zone offenses in the league. David Montgomery, hopefully, if he's healthy and still relatively in his prime, that should change things a lot. The offensive line improvements should change a lot in that regard. And it's pretty easy to take a leap from 13 to higher than that if you're just converting more often in the red zone, converting first downs, scoring touchdowns on the goal line. But beyond that, even, I was looking at Bill Barnwell's ranking of the skill position players on each team, and the Texans are 24th. And one of the reasons he cited was that, yes, Dalton Schultz has been very productive, but he hasn't been that much of a red zone threat. This is one of those chain reactions of things that happen when you don't have a good rushing attack is, man, where do we see play action at its best when it comes to tight ends? Down on the goal line. Where do you see tight ends just wide open? Because when a defense is facing a team on the 3-yard line and they know that, man, they got to really load up and come with everything if they want to stop the run, that's where linebackers really get put in a bind and they end up biting on the run, and you get tight ends that are wide open. Dalton Schultz hasn't had the benefit of the doubt there, and he doesn't have to be Gronk. He doesn't have to be one of these guys, but he should have more easy opportunities for touchdown in the red zone than he's had, just because for the last 3 years, teams haven't respected the rushing attack for the Texans. And what goes into that even a little bit further, and I know I'm going to play a clip from the Athletic Football Show where Derek, whose last name escapes me, is talking about just how limited the Texans offense was over these last couple of years. And he talks about what they just flat out couldn't do.
So much of the burden was on CJ Stroud. Like, they obviously were not a team that could run the ball very much. So they're always in 2nd and 9 and 3rd and 7 and all this stuff. They were also, another small point to that, did not do anything as far as screens go. Like, 2.5% of CJ Stroud's passing yards were screens.
Dead last in the NFL in the percentage of their passes behind the line of scrimmage. And they didn't throw the ball downfield that much. So let's play that out. If you're not throwing the ball behind the line of scrimmage and you're not really pushing the ball downfield, everything that you're doing is operating in like a 0 to 15-yard box. Go watch that play where Craig Woodson comes downhill on the first drive when they're playing against the Patriots in that playoff game. He doesn't give a shit about what is going to go on like behind him and over his head. And when you allow defenses to play like that, that's just one other area where you're really making things hard on yourself. That's why they had 2 deep touchdowns against the Chargers in like 2 seconds.
The Chargers were
because they were willing to take those shots.
Yeah, and again, it sounds like I'm making a lot of excuses for CJ Stroud. We'll get to the critical part of it in a bit here, because there are some things that I think Stroud needs to just take a step forward with in terms of leadership and everything else. Right now, the Texans are plus 1,800 to win the Super Bowl on FanDuel. Those are the 10th shortest odds. So if you look at the teams that are right above them at plus 1,700, the Lions, the Patriots, the Chiefs, and the 49ers, all at plus 1,700. All of them, except for the Patriots, with quarterbacks who have gotten paid already. Drake May, we'll see. Depending on how this year goes, he might be that guy that pushes the $65 million mark. If they do a better job against a much tougher slate of defenses during the regular season, I shouldn't say better job. If they can sustain some level of the offense they had last year versus a incredibly paltry group of defenses in the regular season, then they're going to be pushing the envelope on that. As far as the screens, because that's an alarming stat, like how rarely they threw screens and compared to other teams. Dead last or second to last in a lot of different categories there. Some of that is related to what Solak was talking about earlier. They're facing all these split safety looks. So when you're seeing cover 2, cover 4, cover 6, what do you have? You've got linebackers and defensive backs with their eyes in the backfield. And it is easier for them to diagnose screens and to come up and play them. And I can't fault Caley completely for not calling more screens, because I think they were facing a lot of looks that could really snuff those out pretty easily if that's what they chose to do. The run game, like, to not overly simplify things, but it really is that simple. If they just hammer the run game more effectively, it takes away a lot of those issues. Teams have to start bringing up a safety into the box. You've got more opportunities for deep balls. When the offensive line, when you're seeing a split safety look, it's not like you can't throw deep against those looks, but what you do need is time in the pocket. You need time for those vertical routes to develop as teams do everything they can to take away the short game. And you just couldn't trust that the Texans' offensive line was really going to hold up in those situations. As far as things that Stroud does have to improve, Solak, who was on the Garrett Williams podcast, likes CJ a lot, and I think he thinks more highly of CJ than a lot of other analysts do, perhaps, but especially compared to people that are just looking at box scores and whatnot. Here's Solak on the things that Stroud does have to improve on.
Still has accuracy sprays that you would like for a third-year quarterback not to have. And you would like to see his mechanics cleaned up and his pressure response cleaned up, because he's had this bad offensive line, especially for these last 2 years. He needs to relearn how to trust it, trust his timing, hang in the pocket a little bit better. He came back from the concussion. He wasn't scrambling nearly as much. He was going to trust himself on his feet and be more willing to take hits. Like, there's absolutely stuff he has to do. He's not the problem with the Houston Texans offense. It just isn't. It's very evidently the line of the running game and the fact that they are right now extremely one-dimensional. That's the problem that needs to be solved by Nick Caserio, by Nick Caley, if the Texans are going to be a balanced enough team to make a deep playoff run.
Yeah, okay, so he's just flat out saying, look, he's not the problem with the Houston Texans offense. Well, also, I think pointing out some things that it's easier to foresee him fixing these things if he does have a really solid and steady offensive line in front of him. When he starts to let his footwork get sloppy, some of the things that he's talking about there in either hanging onto the ball too long or knowing exactly when to scramble or when not to. But then thirdly, talking about the accuracy, I think this is a really good point that I've seen a few different people make. Jacob Barzilla has made this point a few times. You hear Ben Solak here. Jacob Barzilla, who's on Texans Twitter, very active there. Good follow. It's that sometimes I think because Stroud called himself a ball placement specialist leading up to the draft in 2023, and because he does make some incredible throws under pressure, his ball placement at times is pristine, that sometimes people forget that his rookie year, he wasn't actually all that much more accurate than he was last year. It's just that in his rookie year, he was able to offset a lot of that with some explosive plays. And he was, as a rookie, a lot of defenses are doing what defenses do versus rookies. They'll blitz them. They'll play more aggressive man coverage and just think, this guy's not going to pull it off. Lo and behold, he did a bunch. And he did it to guys like Nico Collins or Tank Dell. And that all subsided as defenses started treating him with more respect, started treating more split safety looks, all of those things. But he's always had moments or games where even in his rookie season when things were going well, I can remember just fielding calls and comments and texts and tweets and everything about like, CJ didn't look as accurate in that game as he usually does. And I think it just comes in fits and spurts. And some of that is what happens when, if you don't completely trust your pass protection, at times your footwork does get erratic. What I worry about if the Texans don't indeed fix it this year is that this is what we saw with Deshaun Watson before all of the other off-field stuff. Deshaun Watson, his rookie year, he would stand back in the pocket, and you could tell that he'd been watching a lot of Joe. Why am I blanking on Tom Brady? I almost said Joe Brady, the offensive coordinator, is a combination of Joe Montana and Tom Brady. Tom Brady, he'd watched a lot of Tom Brady film. And Tom Brady, as you guys recall, he would just stand there with his feet completely still, like a statue in the pocket, so he could keep his eyes steady and have a stable platform. We could get in a whole argument about whether you should do that or whether you should chop your feet. It's different strokes for different folks. But by the time Deshaun had spent a couple of years really experiencing life in the NFL and getting hit a whole bunch, you started to see some of that, subside a little bit or deteriorate a little bit. And he's still, in 2020, he had a great year as a passer. But, go back all the way to David Carr and what David Carr might have been able to do if he'd had a better environment in his first few years. There's this point in your year 3 or year 4 or year 5 that I think a lot of bad habits can sometimes get cemented. I talked to Sean Pendergast's daughter, who's a psychology major at Harvard, about this, and I told her about my thesis, which is that, look, when you're a young quarterback, any young man, your prefrontal cortex, where you do all your higher level thinking and human type stuff, that's still developing and growing and forming its more permanent bonds up until the age of 25 or so. And she agreed with me. She supported this thesis. And I think I'm going to try to figure out if I can do a trial on monkeys or something. If I can teach monkeys how to play to play football, I just need some rhesus monkeys to play football, and then I can do scans of their do fMRI scans of their prefrontal cortexes. But man, I do think like in your formative years here, when you're in your first few years in the NFL, you're kind of hardwiring some good and bad habits in. And if you don't have a good offensive line in front of you, it's hard to hardwire a lot of those really good traits. And that's what I'd love to see CJ just get, as he finishes off his prefrontal cortex this year. Let's just go ahead and be sure that everything's cemented in and all the synapses are firing the right way. And you do that by having a better offensive line in front of you. Texans are plus 850 to win the AFC Championship right now. I do believe that's come down from what it was earlier in the year. But the plus 850 to win the, AFC Championship on FanDuel. Let's go to the next one, which is a concern. We'll go into some more brain talk here, but this is on the Athletic Football Show. Robert May's talking about kind of an alarming statistic about CJ running and scrambling after his concussion. I've brought up to you before that, man, his yards per carry and the amount of times that he ran after the concussion was a lot lower after the concussion last year than before. But this is a stat I hadn't heard before.
I do think, and I don't want to go too far down this road because you don't want to psychoanalyze people and kind of put something on them that isn't true, but just anecdotally watching him, and the numbers back this up, his scramble rate after coming back from that concussion halved compared to what it was over the first 10 weeks of the season. And I think some of the best stuff that CJ Stroud was doing over the first half of the season is that he was more of a creator than he had been at previous times in his career, in part because he had to be, because of the rest of the offense was so messy and they were just trying to kind of stay afloat. When you watch him in those last couple games, when you watch him in the final month or so of the season, even in games that were better than those playoff games, again, my biggest issue is that when something isn't there quickly for him, he's hanging on it a little too long and then he's panicking. And I think early in the season, when there are plenty of moments where there's just nothing there within the offense in those playoff games. Earlier in the year, he was finding answers with his legs quicker than he was as we got a little bit deeper into the year.
Yeah, and I think that's where sometimes when you bring up the rushing stats after the concussion, it doesn't tell the whole story. Certainly, yes, you're missing out on those yards where perhaps he could have scrambled for more yardage. And I totally get and understand why, especially in that year after the concussion, he might have been more hesitant to run. But also where it comes into the decision-making of instead of running, you're also hanging on too long. And at that point, turning it into what might have been a non-ideal situation and turn into a really bad situation where nothing positive can happen on the play, and whatever might have happened to his decision-making late in the down as he wasn't operating the same way he had been through the first 2/3 of the season. This is what has me wondering if the Texans themselves don't also just want to see CJ a full 9 months post-concussion operate like he's completely recovered from that concussion. Because there's two things. I mean, one, there's the psychological part of it, which I think is pretty easy to grasp and understand. If a guy's just kind of shell-shocked by having been concussed a couple times in his career, does that affect the way that he operates? And then two is just physiologically, there are lingering effects from concussions when it comes to really high-level reaction time stuff that doesn't show up in the normal testing they do for return to play. And when we're talking 10 milliseconds, the difference between being able to track multiple objects downfield. There's been a lot of research done in the last 10 years that show when it comes to high performance athletes or fighter pilots or just people who operate on the razor's edge of performance, it's not always so clear cut when a guy has actually improved. Now, for a young man who, takes care of himself and everything, their brains tend to recover a lot better than people as they get older, or athletes when they're older. So I'm not as worried about the physiological part of it. I think that might explain some of the haphazard decision in the playoffs, or maybe just even in his judgment about when to be aggressive and when not to be aggressive. Those are all concerns that really showed up in the playoffs. And if I'm a team that's about to plunk down $250+ million on a player, I might just want to say, all right, look, we know what the upside is for CJ, but aside from just wanting to see him and the offense operate better, can we see that he individually is completely rid of any of the hangover from that concussion? So, I mean, it's fascinating. The one advantage the Texans also have, if we talk about, let's say the Texans don't sign him to an extension, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You wait until next year. The big fear is, oh my gosh, boy, did you miss out on a chance to sign CJ for $55 million a year or less than that? And now all of a sudden quarterbacks are making $70 million per year. I don't worry about that, just because if he plays well enough to genuinely 100% deserve the new going rate, then cool. All right, you had to pay a little bit more. It's a small tax to pay for safety. It's like paying for your insurance premium. But the Texans also do have an advantage in that they are typically very aggressive. Like with Will Anderson, they went out and got that deal done pretty early in the offseason. Those other quarterbacks like Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels and Drake May and Bo Nix, they're not allowed to even start negotiating with their teams until the league year begins in March. Whereas CJ, because he's a veteran who's under contract, and because he's after his fourth year, the Texans are allowed to restructure his contract anytime they want. So as Nick Caley tends to do we see one of these things where Caley says, all right, well, I think I know where the market is headed. We're going to get in. We're going to pay CJ. maybe super early in the offseason before any of these other teams can really even get to work on it. And then boom, CJ is the highest paid quarterback for like 3 weeks. And then Jaden Daniels signs, Caleb Williams signs, Drake May signs, and it still feels like a relative bargain. I think that might be where the Texans are hedging a bit on it, but should be fascinating for the next month, because I think we'll keep hearing smart people weigh in, and I like hearing their opinions. But most of all, I just want to, other than that, not think about it too much and just get to the regular season as fast as possible and put all this to bed. Okay, CJ, just put it all to bed. Thank you. Hey, if you guys are watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify or on iTunes or wherever you're listening, leave a 5-star review and perhaps some nice comments. It helps all Texans fans find us here where we can have these nice discussions. And everybody have a great one.